A extremely warm welcome to everybody joining us on this very exciting webinar today, where the Ekahau series is going to be exploring 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, the new frontier. Well, we are very excited to have you all here today, but why don't we first of all do a quick round of introductions? And Mac, my friend, why don't you do that for us?
Let's do it. I'm happy you called me a friend, not a colleague. So we are Matt and Mac, directors of ECSE and product marketing, joined with our amazing wireless Stu and Dale, both sales engineers in beautiful America. Hi, guys. It's extremely good to have you here. How are you both doing?
Good to be here.
Doing fantastic. How about yourself?
Never been better in my entire life. Thank you very much for asking. And now, just so I'm not too unpleasant to Matt, Matthew, how are you, my friend?
I'm good, but I have to admit, I'm probably not as excited as Stu or Dale for this webinar. I think they probably are the most excited people when it comes to this webinar. You can just have a little look at the background of their offices, studios, where they are right now. And I think they'll probably tell you everything. So they can't wait for us to get on with the content of the webinar today.
This is the way.
Totally. This is the way.
Brilliant. Well, let's get straight to it. And first of all, you just want to make sure that we are all on the same page, because when it comes to 6 gigahertz, there's lots to discuss, lots of amazing new things for us to talk about and get our heads around. So first of all, let's discuss the 6 gigahertz channels that are now available for us to use for Wi-Fi. And first of all, we're going to talk about the Americas, the US, and you're actually getting an additional 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum, which is more than double the amount of the current spectrum that we had to use with 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, which is fantastic because we needed the additional spectrum. So how does that correlate then to the amount of channels that we are going to be able to use for our Wi-Fi deployments? Well, if we were to break it down, this would mean that we would now have an additional, in 6 gigahertz, an extra 59 times 20 megahertz wide channels, or 29 times 40 megahertz wide channels, or 15 times 80 megahertz wide channels, or if you wanted to, you can use 7 times 160 megahertz wide channels. And then what we have done is we've broken it down into what's referred to as the radio bands. And in the US, you get Uni 5, Uni 6, Uni 7, and Uni 8. And then what we have done is we've highlighted the channel numbers, and they're broken up into the 20 megahertz channels. And the ones that we have highlighted in white, these are the preferred scanning channels, or we refer to them as the PSC channels. And we are going to explain a little bit more about PSC and why that's important for when it comes to discovering 6 gigahertz networks in a few slides times. But one thing that we just wanted to point out here is that depending on where you are in the world, you're going to have access to a different amount of channels to use in 6 gigahertz. So this is an example for in the US, and Mac is going to talk to you about the amount of additional 6 gigahertz spectrum we're getting over here in the EU.
Okay, so thank you for the US introduction to 6 gigahertz, guys. Just to put it into perspective, like what 6 gigahertz means, let's take a look at the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz spectrum first. So 2.4 had around 80 megahertz of usable spectrum, but in fact, we are using around 60 megahertz, 3 non-overlapping channels. So that's not too much, is it? 5 gigahertz, depending on the country, depending on the region, around 20 megahertz channels, which translates to around 500 megahertz, half a gig of spectrum. And 6 gigahertz in States, it gives us 1.2 gig of spectrum. So more than what we've had before and double that. So that's a lot of spectrum. And in Europe, we are pretty much matching what we had available on 5 gigahertz. So we have 500 megahertz of additional spectrum. So that's still a lot. Not as great as in States, but it's still a lot. So in the EU, it translates to 20 megahertz channels down from 59 in States. The difference is massive, but it's still a lot of channels, guys, don't get me wrong. But we will come back to the white channels, the PSC, the preferred scan channels, or preferred channels, I sometimes call them as well, you will see why it is not too practical to perhaps be using 80 megahertz channels in the EU, and why it might be the default in States. We've also followed up this discussion with proper real tests with 6 gigahertz devices, different types of devices with different vendors, and then we will try to answer the question, do you really need to stick to 80 megahertz even in States, or can you rely on different discovery methods than the PSC that we will talk about in a second? So that's it when it comes to intro to 6 gigahertz band.
Okay, so let's move on then to what we're referring to as the 6 gigahertz BSS discovery. And to break that down, what we're actually referring to here is how are our client devices going to discover 6 gigahertz wireless networks. So how, when you pull your mobile phone that's 6 gigahertz capable out of your pocket, when you go into a venue and they have access points that support 6 gigahertz radios and SSIDs, how is my phone going to find and associate to one of these 6 gigahertz radios and one of the 6 gigahertz SSIDs? And I'm going to talk to you about what I think is the most exciting and the most cool way of discovering 6 gigahertz wireless networks. And we refer to it as the out of band discovery, which is actually something that we've never used before when it comes to Wi-Fi, because before, with 2.4 or 5 gigahertz discovery of wireless networks, we was always discovering the wireless network on the frequency that we was currently using. So if you're using 2.4 gigahertz and connects into a 2.4 gigahertz radio, you're discovering that on 2.4 gigahertz. But this new method, called the reduced neighbor report, or referred to as RNR, this is actually when we have a access point that is tri-band, so 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz. And what the access point can do on its either 2.4 or 5 gigahertz radio, it can actually inform the client device about its co-located 6 gigahertz radio, so that the client device, your client device, doesn't have to go and scan 11 channels on 2.4 gigahertz, 25 channels on 5 gigahertz, and then 59 channels on 6 gigahertz, because that might take quite a little bit of time. So now when the access point informs your client device through this new information element called the reduced neighbor report, it says, hey, Mr. Client device, I have a co-located radio on 6 gigahertz and it is using channel 69 as an example. And then your device goes, oh, brilliant. I don't need to go and scan all of those channels. I can go and scan just that channel, and then I can associate to 6 gigahertz, which for me, I think is very cool, very interesting. But one of the things that me and Mac were discussing and thinking about was, when it comes to using this reduced neighbor report, if I wanted to leverage that feature, would I have to have the same SSID configured across all of the same frequency bands? So like, let's, for example, say we've got an Ekahau corporate SSID. Would I need to broadcast Ekahau corporate across 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz to leverage the reduced neighbor report? Because typically in the deployments that me and Mac had done over the past few years, we wasn't using the same SSID across 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. We wanted to keep it separated and to a dedicated frequency band so we could improve connectivity and roaming. And especially with 6 gigahertz, when we start to talk about the security, we was wondering, would we have to go to that method to use RNR? So we tested it out. What we did is we got a tri-band capable access point, and we set up some SSIDs to be single band only. So just broadcast on 5 gigahertz an SSID, and just broadcast a SSID on 6 gigahertz. And what you're looking at here is just a screenshot of Wireshark, where we did a wireless packet capture from that particular access point. And we are looking at the that new information element, and it's the reduced neighbor report. And on 5 gigahertz, because the capture was done on the 5 gigahertz radio. If I go back, you can see, if I just move my mouse here, it was captured on channel 36. So that's on 5 gigahertz. And this is where we see that reduced neighbor report. And we can see inside of this information, it's telling us that actually it's got a co-located access point and it's on channel 5 on 6 gigahertz, and it hasn't got the same SSID. So that was really good to know from our testing perspective, that we can leverage reduced neighbor report, and we don't have to have the same SSID broadcasted across multiple frequency bands, which is going to be especially important for us over here in the EU. So that was the outer band discovery. Mac, why don't you tell us all about some of the in-band discovery methods?
Sure, that will be my pleasure. So guys, as Matt has said, it was out of band discovery. This is a new concept, right? So in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz before, we had only in-band discovery, and we just had two methods, active or passive. Active was probing on non-DFS channels. So I could quickly, as a device, ask, hello, anyone out there on channel 36? And then all the access points on channel 36 will respond very fast to my inquiry. And that's fast and beautiful, but we can't probe on DFS channels. So out of 25 channels, we can probe on 9, but can't probe on 16 of them. And on these 16 channels, we have to, by default, wait for beacons passively on 2.4 and 5, okay? But these were all in-band methods. Fast, probe request, probe response, and slower, waiting for beacon, passive one. And we would be waiting for like at least 105 milliseconds, maybe a little bit longer, because beacons, as you might know, they are being sent around 10 times a second. To be exact, around 102.4 milliseconds is the target beacon send time. So now I will talk about the in-band methods, and there are actually 4, but we will just discuss 2, because 2 of them, they have not been implemented in the real world. We've tested like, I don't know, 4 or 5 vendors, and we haven't seen different discovery in-band methods being used other than FILS and PSC. So let's start with the more boring one, which is FILS. I say it's boring because it's probably on its way out from what vendors are implementing today. Major vendors, some of them, they support FILS, and most of them, they don't. So in Matthew's house, he has no FILS at all. In my house, I'm using a different vendor. So I have few test Cambium APs, for example. They do use FILS quite happily. And a FILS is very similar to the beacon, okay? And now what the problem with beacons was? The problem with beacons is that for every SSID, for every radio, you will have around 10 beacons a second in the air. So if you have multiple SSIDs, like, you know, some companies, they have like 5 or 6 or 10 SSIDs, and quite a lot of radios co-located on the same channel, overlapping with their own access points, with their neighbors' access points. That means that we have so many beacons on the same channel that it doesn't leave too much space for the data conversation between our clients and access points. So FILS, it tries to solve it a little bit by being way smaller than beacon. But now, since we have up to 59 channels on 6 gigahertz, we cannot dwell on every channel for 105 milliseconds, because that would take us more than 6 seconds to just discover a single beacon on every channel. Potentially, we can't have that. So FILS is not being sent every 100-ish milliseconds. It's being sent every 20 milliseconds. So we have 5 times more FILS frames than we did have beacon frames. So even though they are considerably smaller than a beacon frame, they will still contribute to few percent, depending on the minimum basic data rates, of protocol overhead, of management frames overhead. That is not really required, and therefore we probably won't be using FILS in the future. But just bear in mind that it's still there, okay? And now let's move to the PSC, preferred scanning channels. You must recall the white channels from previous slides, where every second channel is white. Okay, well, a second channel in every 4th channel bonded channel is white. So channel 5, 21, and so on and so forth. Why is it important to understand, to remember this? The rules have changed in 2.4 and 5. If you were bonding channels, well, hopefully you didn't bond channels on 2.4. You never do that stuff, do you? But if you did, typically, by default, first channel in the bundled channel will be your primary channel. In 6 gigahertz, second channel will be your primary channel by default. So that's a little bit different. And now the purpose of the PSC is to just scan the channels that Matt is highlighting, the white ones. Now, why is it better for us? Because we have, depending on the region, 15 of those in the US or 6 of those in the EU. And scanning 15 or 6 versus 59 or 24 makes the passive scanning or active scanning, but in-band scanning faster because you scan less amount of channels. So that's the PSC. And because of PSC, when 6 gigahertz was introduced to the market, tons of us working in the Wi-Fi industry thought that this is going to dictate the channel width. Having in mind that you will have to use PSC discovery to discover your 6 gigahertz, you will have to scan every 4th channel. So since you're scanning every 4th channel and not every channel, why not use 80 megahertz? It makes sense. 80 megahertz, if you're forced to use PSC, makes sense. But it might make sense in states where you have 15 of these channels, but in Europe, we have just 6. And the overlapping on the same channel, the channel contention, it's still real on 6 gigahertz. And if you have just 6 in higher density environments in Europe, for example, we won't be able to use 80 megahertz at all. So in states, it might be a stretch. In Europe, it might be impossible. So we wanted to check if we can use something else than PSC. And as Matthew has mentioned, RNR works in all the scenarios that we've tested, okay? So now we think actually that PSC will probably not be the main discovery method. It might still be used, but it's not the main discovery method. The main one is RNR, out-of-band discovery method. And for this reason, you always want to have an SSID, at least one on either 2.4 and 5, even if you don't plan on using these bands. You probably will still use 2.4 and 5 and 6 at the same time. But even if you didn't plan on doing anything on 2.4 and 5, just have a dummy SSID so you can discover your 6 gigahertz using RNR. Okay, hope that this makes sense.
Thanks, Mac. So something else you wanted to talk to you about is when we will be bonding channels together in Wi-Fi. How did it work currently in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and how is it going to be slightly different in 6 gigahertz? So before Wi-Fi 6E or 6 gigahertz, in 5 gigahertz, for example, if you was planning to, let's say, bond 2 channels together, so go to a 40 megahertz wide channel, what that would mean is that every time that you double your channel width, that means that you are effectively doubling the amount of noise that you bring into the channel. And to double the amount in Wi-Fi, we go up by 3 dBs, or if we're going to reduce by half, we're going to go down by 3 dBs. So if you take a look at this first example here in this column, where we've got a 20 megahertz wide channel prior to 6 gigahertz, we can see that we have got a signal to noise ratio here of 25 dBs. But when we double this channel and we go from a 20 megahertz wide channel to a 40 megahertz wide channel, because we are doubling the amount of noise that comes into the channel, this means that our signal to noise ratio is going to go down by 3 dBs. So if we take a look at our SNR value here, it goes down to 22 dBs from 25. And then if you double it again from a 40 megahertz wide channel to an 80 megahertz wide channel, well, we're doubling the amount of noise again. So we're going up by 3 dBs. So that means that our SNR value is going to go down by 3 dBs again. So now our SNR value is down to 19 dBs. So the reason why you would bond your channels together in Wi-Fi is so that you can achieve higher data rates, faster throughput for your client devices. But this would often be at a cost of the performance of the quality of the signal. So therefore, meaning that if you were quite close to the cell edge of your Wi-Fi signal, you may be able to achieve faster speeds if you were closer to the access point. But if you were right around the edge of where you had that good SNR value before and you make a bonded channel, then you may not be able to achieve that good quality signal to be able to achieve those higher data rates anyway. So having wider channels often came at a bit of a payoff and cost for doing that. But that does change with 6 gigahertz and Wi-Fi 6E. And at a high level, because this is going to be different again, depending on the region and where you are, and we'll break that down for US versus EU in a couple of slides time. But at a high level, what we're going to do now in 6 gigahertz, when we bond a channel together to offset the price of the performance going down by 3 dBs because of the amount of noise that's coming into the channel, we're going to increase what we refer to here as the EIRP, which is the equivalent isotropic radiated power, basically turning up the transmit power of our radio inside of access point. We're going to go up by 3 dBs. So now each time that you double the channel width, we will be maintaining pretty much a constant SNR. So we won't have to have that kind of trade-off or cost for bonding the channels together to get that higher data rate. So therefore, in the US, using 80 megahertz wide channels could be a feasible option potentially, and be able to have that higher data rates and have that higher quality of signal. But how does it work specifically in the US, and the kind of formula that is used to calculate this? And Mac is going to break that down for you now.
Yep, sure. So what Matthew has talked us through is a very simplified view of what happens when you bond channels and don't change anything else. He has mentioned EIRP. So before we continue, let's answer the question what the EIRP is. So you don't have to remember what that means, but the EIRP is a radiated power, the signal density, and the EIRP is basically the transmitting power level of a radio plus passive antenna gain. That's also a simplified view. So transmitting power level plus passive antenna gain. Directional antennas will have higher gain. Omnis, they will have lower gain. Let's not go there too much, but that's what it is. If you want to have like a full definition, then you will need to start adding more things to the EIRP calculation. It will be the transmitting power minus the attenuation of connectors and antenna cables plus or minus passive gain of the antenna. I say minus because like mobile devices, they have like a zigzag little tiny antennas. They typically have gain that is a minus gain. And also some vendors, when they calculate the EIRP, they will also take under consideration the MIMO operation of their hardware. So if they have multiple radio chains, multiple antennas, they will theoretically have higher EIRP thanks to that as well. So that's the EIRP for you. And now let's talk about states. So in states, I wanted to draw your attention to a few things. First thing is that the PSD, so power spectral density, second column, it is constant at 5 megahertz, 5 dBm per megahertz. It's very important because in very short, it says that we don't care how wide the channel is. We don't care about that. We don't care about any of that. We always want to have the same amount of energy per megahertz. 20 megahertz channel will have the same PSD. 40 megahertz channel will have the same PSD. That means that we are allowed to carry the same amount of energy. We are allowed to increase the transmitting power levels to hit the higher EIRP thresholds, meaning that if we start bonding channels from 20 to 40, from 40 to 80, from 80 to 160, we are adding noise to our channels. So before 6 gigahertz, we were losing 3 dBs of SNR every time we bond the channels. But now what we are doing, what we can do in 6 gigs is we increase our transmitting power levels in states to keep the SNR, the last column, the EIRP correlated to the noise flow. We increase it every time we bond by 3 dBs, and therefore our SNR does not change. So bear in mind, now look at the column in the middle, the max EIRP column, that the maximum allowed by FCC, local reg body in states, it does allow EIRP, maximum EIRP, to rise by 3 dBs every time we bond channels. So it's not constant. It's the wider the channel, the higher the allowed maximum EIRP. And that means when we increase the noise flow, we can have the last column, EIRP, in correlation to noise flow, constant, around 18 dBs. And most of us, assuming that we are like using all the defaults and golden rules for carpeted office spaces and stuff, we probably are designing to like 14 dBm transmitting power levels plus passive gain of omnidirectional antennas. That translates to roughly 18 dBm in most cases. And that's absolutely fine. And we are not losing energy when we start bonding channels. 18 constant in states. Now let's take a look at Europe. What's changing there? So in the EU, we have actually two things that's changed. First is the second column. You can see that now we are looking at 10 dBm per megahertz PSD versus 5, meaning that in Europe, we are allowing to have higher signal density per megahertz. We are allowing our signals to be stronger. So that's the main thing. But now look at the middle column, maximum EIRP. We can have stronger signal per megahertz, more spectral density per megahertz, but our maximum EIRP is constant of 23. It doesn't matter if we have 20 megahertz channel or 40 or 80, we can't go for higher EIRP, we can't have higher EIRP than 23 dBm. And that means that on the 20 and 40 megahertz channels, now the last column, we can have a very high spectral density on our channels that are not too wide, 20 and 40. 23 and 20 is above market standard. It's a lot and higher than in the States. But on 80 megahertz channel, now we are starting to drop to 17, which is below the maximum levels allowed in States. And 160 and 320 megahertz, it goes even lower. But you know what? When I talk about 160 and 320 in Europe, we don't care. We absolutely don't care. 20 and 40 can be very, very strong. 80 is still strong enough. And then the rest, we don't care. So the rules in States and in Europe, they are different. And have that in mind that we will not be maintaining the same SNR potentially in Europe when we start bonding channels.
Great. So based on that information, then what we would love to know is when you're designing for your 6 gigahertz channel plan, what channel widths are you planning to use in the channel plans? Are you going to use 20 megahertz wide, 40 megahertz wide, 80s, or 160s? So yeah, we would love to know what you're planning to use with your 6 gigahertz deployments, and we will just give it a few moments time to let everyone on the webinar today have a chance to cast your votes. It's looking very interesting at the moment. So I'm going to end the poll in a few seconds, and then I will share the results with everybody. Yeah, okay, end poll, and by Mac, share results. Okay, sharing the results, and we can see actually that the highest percentage amount was actually for 40s, so 40 megahertz wide channels, and 47%, close behind 80 megahertz wide, and then followed by the 20s, and only a few of you decided to go for 160 megahertz wide. And I see a lot of people in the chat saying, yeah, it depends on the environment and where we are in the world. Of course, we totally agree with you on that one as well. But it was just interesting for us to know kind of what you're planning to use. I think probably for us in Europe, Mac, I think we would probably be leaning more towards 40 megahertz wide channels, potentially. And then if we was in the States, 80 megahertz wide channels. But we have some interesting things to think about if we are going to use 40 megahertz wide channels or 20 megahertz wide channels in the EU, and we've got a demo on that coming up very shortly, actually. Okay.
Yep. So this is, guys, I'm proud of you, by the way, because I was expecting that everyone will say, oh, 6 gigahertz equals 80 megahertz because of PSC. It's not the case. Great stuff. So we want to use wider channels if we can, but the reality is that in most cases we won't be able to use 80s anyway. Okay. So what is the biggest performance killer in Wi-Fi? Guys, put it in the chat. What do you think is the biggest performance killer in Wi-Fi? Is it, I won't say anything else. Yeah. Just let us know what you think. Okay, we have CCI, contention, interference, layer 8, airtime collisions.
I'm loving this discussion. This is really good.
I'm glad you like it, mate.
Oh, love this.
Motion sensors, co-channel interference, SNR, poor design. There's lots and lots of great answers there. Lots of great answers. But Mac, what do we think is one of the biggest?
So I think that one of the biggest killers, or the biggest killer, is the excessive contention. But you might have a different view on that, Matthew, don't you?
No, I actually, maybe for the first time, I'll agree with you, shall I?
My wife. I love it.
I do believe contention in Wi-Fi is one of the biggest performance killers, and contention can be in many different formats with co-channel interference, adjacent channel interference, or sometimes we refer to this primary, secondary overlapping BSS interference, which we're going to come on to in a few moments' time. But I bet if there's probably a lot of people watching the webinar today and thinking, if Matt and Mac ever got into a fight, who would win? And well, let me put you out of your misery and make that clear. Of course, I would win in the fight, not Mac.
Yeah, so Matt might be a little bit more nimble than me, but remember that I'm twice as big, so he doesn't hurt me anyway.
Okay, so Mac, why don't you explain a little bit then quickly, what is this primary, secondary OBSS thing that we were just talking about?
Totally. So guys, I'm not sure if you remember, in the old world of 2.4 gigahertz, there were two types of interferences, like overlapping and overlapping across entire channel, okay, like the CCI, or where the primary channels overlap, for example, like 20 megahertz, CCI, same channel overlapping. And since we have like channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 overlapping partially when you have multiple radios on these channels, this is called the adjacent channel interference, and it's worse than the cross channel, same channel interference. So if you have, let's say, APs on channel 1 and 3, it's worse than having APs, both of them on channel 1 or both of them on channel 3. For example, that was the ACI, potentially was a performance killer on 2.4, but practically it wasn't, because not many people were bonding channels or using different channels than 1, 6, and 11, hopefully, okay? Hopefully we are these people that don't use different channels to 1, 6, and 11. On 5 gigahertz, however, we didn't have concept of the ACI, adjacent channel interference, because all the channels that we have on 5 gigs, and actually in 6 gigs as well, these two bands are more similar than we think. All of these channels, they don't overlap. So channel 36 and channel 40, they are adjacent channels, but they don't overlap where it matters, okay? So what we are looking at here now is the perfect world scenario. We have two BSSs. BSS is like the radios with associated stations to them, and they are operating on different channels that are adjacent, but not overlapping. And there is a very important concept called the primary channel. And what does the primary channel mean? Why is it important? You can see that we have channels 38 and 46, meaning that we have bonded 40 megahertz channels consisting of channel 36 and 40 on the left-hand side and 44 and 48 on the right-hand side. And we've shown you the primary channels there. So the primary channel is always 20 megahertz. Primary channel is always 20 megahertz. And Wi-Fi is a very polite protocol, okay? Even if you have tons of clients contending for the airtime, all of them, they will try to play the game nicely to the point where they listen before they talk. And even if there is someone's turn to talk, they will still listen before they talk. If there is no one else, then they will talk, okay? And they are listening on a primary channel. So even if you have 40 megahertz channel, 36 plus 40, and 36 is primary, in most cases, for simplicity reasons, let's just assume that all the clients, they will be listening before they talk on channel 36 and not on channel 40. So this is a perfect scenario, and we understand what the primary channel is. Just to add to the primary channel is being used for all the control and management frames as well, which consists of 30, 40, 50%, depending on the generation of Wi-Fi and what types of traffic we have in the air, of all the frames being sent, okay? They're all being sent on primary channels and not bonded channels. The bonded channels, the fast ones, they are just for data, okay? They are just for data. So now this is the perfect world, no overlapping. Matthew, let's switch to the next slide. And if you could talk us through what's changed here and why is it so bad?
Yeah, of course. So in this scenario, you can see that second BSS or AP2 has now moved to be sharing the same part of the frequency that our access point 1 or BSS1 was occupying. But you can see the difference here is that actually the AP2 is, yes, using that same channels 36 and channel 40, occupying that same 40 megahertz of spectrum. But the primary channel of the access point 2 is using channel 40, whereas the AP1 is using channel 36 as its primary channel. So when these two access points, they go to listen on the channel, oh, hey, is there any other Wi-Fi transmission on this channel trying to talk at the moment? They're not going to be able to do what's called preamble detect or signal detect, where they can understand the conversation that someone is saying, how long they're going to be talking for. Very much like when Mac starts talking to me in Polish, I have no idea what he's talking about or how long he's going to be talking for. But when he's talking in English, I understand it. I know how long he's going to be talking for. And then I know that when I'm going to get my opportunity to transmit. So what happens in this situation is that the access points, they're not going to understand each other, that the Wi-Fi device is trying to transmit on the same channel. And then they will just try and transmit their Wi-Fi frames anyway, which is going to be very likely to lead to something that's called a collision, and then probably a corruption of the frame. So the receiver doesn't actually receive that frame and then send an acknowledgement back to the device. And when that happens, that means that we have to do something that's called a retransmission or a retry. And we get punished every time we have that on our wireless network, because then our contention window gets doubled. So we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. And if you've got this in your environment on 5 gigahertz, it'll probably be one of the biggest performance killers to your network. So watch out for that. We want to try and avoid it at all costs if we can. So in an ideal scenario, it's better to have obviously no co-channel interference. But if we are going to have channel interference, it's better that we have channel interference on the same primary channel, rather than causing ourselves this scenario, primary, secondary, OBSS, or in 2.4 gigahertz, adjacent channel interference. But this was 5 gigahertz. So we had this thought that surely primary, secondary, OBSS won't affect us on the 6 gigahertz band, right? Right. Well, actually, Mac, why don't you give us a live demo in our beautiful Ekahau AI Pro?
Of course. Let's take a look. So you should see my screen now. So we have our Helsinki office here. I'm filtering against purple access points. This is the pure 6 gigahertz deployment. This is a test deployment. Okay, so don't think like we don't know what we're doing there. We've created this deployment of 6 gigahertz to show you how to troubleshoot issues. But what is wrong with the configuration of the 6 gigahertz network? 6 gigahertz is in light blue. So we can see channel 53 at 80 megahertz, 69 at 160, 37 at 80, 37 at 80, 85 at 80. So we have a mixture of different channel widths. And also we have tons of radios operating on the same channel, okay? On the same channel. So I want to take a look at how this spectrum overlaps between different radios and different channel widths. So I will select like a point somewhere, whatever, here. And then on the right-hand side, we can see where I clicked. This is like going back in history. We were looking at the survey done a few months ago. You can see these are 20 megahertz channels, 20 megahertz, 20, 20. But now this is 40, this is 40. And inside this 40 megahertz channel, we have multiple radios on 20 megahertz. So that guy is on channel 69 at 160. So actually this is a 160 megahertz channel and these are 80 megahertz channels. So my primary channel is channel 69, but the guys inside this massive 160 megahertz channels, they will be creating primary, secondary OBSS. So I will be listening on a second channel in the bonded channel. Anyone out there, anyone talking, listening before I talk, I will discover guys on these channels, perhaps this one, but these guys, if they are transmitting actively, I will listen before I talk, preamble detect on channel 69 around here. So I will ignore transmissions from this adjacent channels, okay? And then we will have two radios or clients shouting on top of each other, creating collisions. So the targets to where the frames are sent to, they won't be able to demodulate the transmission. They won't send the acknowledgements back to the clients or access points sending the frames. And collision, no acknowledgement, means they have to go back to the queue, play the contention medium access game again, and it slows down the Wi-Fi for everyone. So this might be a very, very huge performance killer, especially if we start mixing channel widths, okay, between, even if our environment is amazing and we stick to one channel width, it's very possible that our neighbors, they will be using different channel widths or a mixture of channel widths. And for as long as they hear us and we hear them, we will still affect each other. And we can have a very real problem of primary, secondary, or BSS. So please look out for it, okay? Even if it's not a one-to-one overlapping, you might have the primary, secondary overlapping, meaning you will have channels overlapping, but not on their primary channel. And that can be a massive problem. So this is a primary, secondary, or BSS. Now, guys, since we are talking about the fancy 6 gigahertz things and features, let's take a look at one of the killer features that we have. And actually, this is so important. Like, how many of you have ever been asked a question? You have your network, or you create a network, or you are planning to optimize or change your network, change the hardware from old one to new one. You had some issues with your old Wi-Fi. And now, how many times have you heard, oh, I have issues with vendor X. Now, what would happen if I change to vendor Y? Surely they will fix my issues. And then vendor Y will say, okay, replace your network with my access points and all your issues will be gone. Is that going to be the case? And the answer to it is probably not. So let's take a look at what we have here. We have a Ruckus APs. There seem to be a fairly old APs. Let me look at the blue APs only. So we don't have any access points that are blue in this particular area. We have coverage issue in this particular meeting room. And now this client, a vendor, whoever it is, they say, okay, we want to replace Ruckus with, I don't know, something else, Mist. Newer access points, newer generation, 6 gigahertz. I want to do rip and replace. So is it going to fix my issues? Will my coverage be better? And now, instead of just thinking about it and assuming that it's going to fix our problems, we can use a network simulator tool built into Ekahau AI Pro. It's actually quite a new tool that we offer, but using survey data from your existing network, a Ruckus-based network, you can ask Ekahau by going to Actions and Network Simulator. You can ask Ekahau, how would my network look like if I ripped and replaced a specific old access point model with a newer, beautiful tri-band access points? So let's choose a new-ish AP, tri-band 2.45 and 6. Let me drop to 20 megahertz, and I will simulate that change now. So now Ekahau AI Pro is thinking in the background, calculating based on the survey, what would the signal strength and all other visualizations look like if I had changed my vendor X to vendor Y? Newer APs, more expensive APs. Is it going to fix my issues? And we see that it looks a little bit different, but it still hasn't fixed my problem, okay? So now we know that rip and replace is not going to work. If we want to correct our network, optimize it, fix it, we need to take a step back and do a redesign, okay? And that's what I wanted to talk you through. Remember, network simulation tool in Ekahau AI Pro, so you don't have to learn the hard way. You can simulate it before buying the hardware and placing it on your ceilings.
Okay, let me go back to sharing, and we should hopefully all be back to seeing my screen now. And very recently, we got some 6 gigahertz devices in our environments. We've got some 6 gigahertz access points. We've got some 6 gigahertz client devices. We're very active on social media, and we saw there were some people, kind of curious or had some questions around to the connectivity of their 6 gigahertz devices and in some specific scenarios. So we saw this tweet, and we wanted to test it out for ourselves, and it's specifically around an iPad that is 6 gigahertz capable and being able to connect to a 6 gigahertz only SSID. how that would be working and if there's anything to watch out for there. So we got a few devices. We've obviously got our amazing Ekahau Sidekick 2, which fully supports all of our Wi-Fi frequency bands, 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz. But we've got, I got myself a Cisco Meraki 6 gigahertz capable access point. Max got a Cambium one in his environment. And then we had a few devices to test out. So we got the MacBook Pros with the 6 gigahertz capable radio, the iPad, and we got a Pixel Pro. We wanted to do some testing to check out how these devices would perform connecting to the 6 gigahertz radios if we configured them in specific different ways. So we wanted to test out, first of all, the way that we said in that tweet, whereas if we had an SSID that was broadcasted on on 6 gigahertz only, and if we had another SSID that was being broadcasted on 5 and 6 gigahertz, how was the behavior slightly different for the device? So I set up my environment to have a SSID called Ekahau 5 and 6 gigahertz broadcast on 5 and 6 gigahertz, and I set up another SSID for just Ekahau 6 gigahertz on 6 gigahertz only. And then I got my iPad. I first of all connected it to my 5 and 6 gigahertz SSID, and it just connected first time, no issues, no warning messages, and associated, fine, no problem at all. And then I disconnected from that SSID and I connected to the 6 gigahertz only SSID, and I got this limited compatibility warning message. And my device connected fine. It was able to use the network and it had no problems at all, but it was strange that we did get this limited compatibility message. So in my environment with one device and one access point, it was no problem, but I wonder if it would be an issue if we had multiple access points just on 6 gigahertz. Who knows, something else for us to test out. But then we had another thought, is like, well, what would happen if we decided to disable the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz radios and just have the 6 gigahertz SSID broadcasting on just the 6 gigahertz radio? And Mac, what happened?
Yeah, your iPad will be like, dude, where's my Wi-Fi? So now what we've seen, Matt had 6 gigahertz only SSID, but at the same time, he had 5 gigahertz collocated different SSIDs, and he was still using probably RNR, okay? And without that, on just 6 gigahertz, Apple devices, they won't be able to find any network, okay? They simply won't. But how about non-Apple devices, Matt?
I know. So then I got the Pixel Pro out, and the Pixel Pro was like, hey, don't worry, Mr. Apple, hold my beer, I got this, and was able to connect to the 6 gigahertz SSID, no problem at all. So both devices, 6 gigahertz capable, right next to each other, same access point, same SSID, same 6 gigahertz radio broadcasting, but my Apple device could no longer hear, find, or discover the 6 gigahertz SSID, but the Android device could. So that was quite interesting to know. I know it's probably quite a corner case that I don't imagine we're ever going to deploy just access points with their 6 gigahertz radios enabled, but it was interesting for us to test. And if you don't know by now, then me and Matt get quite excited about testing these kind of things. But what we kind of assume straight away is that the Apple devices was really relying on the reduced neighbor report to discover the 6 gigahertz capable SSID, whereas the Android device could use multiple different discovery methods to still be able to discover the 6 gigahertz network. But that did get us a little bit excited. Our nerd knobs were flashing, thinking, oh my gosh, what else could I test? We've got these devices now, we've got these access points, we want to set up our environment and try out different scenarios, because what if we configure our radios to use 20 megahertz wide, 40 megahertz wide? What if we don't use PSC channels? All of this kind of thing. So we got very excited and we decided we was going to do some different tests. So what were those tests, Mac?
Oh, that's a very good question, my friend. So we are quite nerdy when it comes to this test. By the way, guys, have you noticed when Matthew was saying like how cool the Android was when it came to discovery, he was quite uncomfortable telling us that someone has done something better than Apple. So these are the tests that we have done. First test is the dual band SSID. Both 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz radios were enabled, and on 5 gigahertz, on 6 gigahertz, sorry, we were using PSC channels, 80 megahertz PSC channels. Test number 1. Test number 2, we had dual band SSIDs. So the same SSID or different SSID, whatever, on at least 2 bands, 6 gigahertz plus something else, it was 5 gigs. But this time we had non-PSC 6 gigahertz channels. And the last 2 tests, they were done only on 6 gigahertz. No collocated radios, they were turned off, just 6 gigs, no 5, no 2.4. And we've done 1 test with PSC 6 gigahertz channels and 1 test with non-PSC 6 gigahertz channels. We were testing it with the iPad Pro M2, with Pixel Pro, with MacBook Pro M2. So all the newest, latest and greatest devices, except of Pixel 7 is now on the market. We still have 6 Pro, but we've checked the firmware on both and it should match. So it should still be a relevant test. So now on this slide, you can grab a picture of it if you want to a screenshot, or you can come back later to it if you want to dive. But on a very, very, very high level, the test number 1 was 5 and 6, where 6 was on PSC channels, and all of our devices, Apple and Android, they could discover 6 gigahertz, no problem at all. Okay. We also had another question from the community. Andrew McHale has asked us a question about which device discovers 6 gigahertz faster. And then the answer is, it depends, right? So it seems that Apple is scanning 2.4 before 5 gigahertz, funnily enough. So since we had just 5 and 6 gigahertz and we were using RNR for the discovery, out-of-band discovery using collocated radios to find out about 6 gigs, Android was going straight to 5 gigahertz, discovering it fast. Apple was going for 2.4, then 5 gigahertz, discovering it a little bit slower. But that's it. After they are connected, it doesn't matter anymore, does it? Cool. Second test, same stuff, but we had non-PSC channel. Since we are still using RNR, the tests were identical, okay? Test number 3, we've turned off 5 gigahertz radio. We are using PSC channel, but we don't have 2.4 and 5 gigahertz enabled anymore. And now the second that we've disabled 2.4 and 5 gigahertz radios, we didn't have anything but 6. Apple devices, they were not able to discover 6 gigahertz network anymore. So we know that they have to use RNR, just RNR. And in our environments, Matt's environment and mine, our pixels in my house, they still could discover the network because my vendor is using fields. And in Matt's environment, they couldn't because his vendor doesn't use fields. So, you know, this very fast, small, tiny beacons. And now the last test was to have non-PSC channel, and Matthew's devices, they couldn't discover anything. And my Android could discover network, no problem, using fields again. Okay, so the conclusion to these tests are Apple needs RNR. Everything else is a corner case, because if Apple just uses RNR, it means that everyone will have to be using RNR and all the vendors will be supporting and using RNR. So always use RNR. And if you don't need 2.4 or 5, have a dummy SSID for Apple devices to be able to discover 6 gigahertz using collocated out-of-band radios.
Yeah, and the other thing just to call out here as well is that this was testing that we've done that this year in the last few weeks, last couple of months. You never know what can change with a software update to these devices, and they would behave differently potentially. So it's always good to test out in your real world deployments with your real world client devices. But we thought it's really interesting, so we just wanted to share that with you, because I'm sure lots of you are now planning to deploy 6 gigahertz wireless networks and have these 6 gigahertz client devices come on the market. And Max said as well that there was some other people in the community that had some questions around 6 gigahertz, and I've seen some similar ones come in on the chat around, especially around configuring the SSIDs and what security to use for the 6 gigahertz networks, just like what our good friend Harry here was asking us, and do they need to have separate SSIDs, and what should we do? Which was a great question, because when you configure your SSIDs, but that is 6 gigahertz capable, your SSID on 6 gigahertz, it's mandatory that it has to use WPA version 3. And the other thing that is also mandatory that it has to use is management frame protection, which is sometimes referred to as protected management frames, depending on the vendor. And what we're looking at here is my SSID that is broadcasted on 5 and 6 gigahertz. And we're looking at a screenshot from our Ekahau analyzer application. So this is what we can see here on 6 gigahertz, and we can see the 5 gigahertz kind of configuration here. But why is this so important to take into consideration? It's because, you know, if you have one SSID that is broadcasted across multiple frequency bands, let's just say Ekahau corporate, and you just have that SSID on its own and it's broadcasted across 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz, well, you're going to have to enable WPA3 for the 6 gigahertz radio. But what you might do is you might just say, oh, I'm just going to blanket enable WPA version 3 across the other frequency bands as well, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. And that means that management frame protection will be required as well. And that is what I did. So I went into my SSID configuration. I configured it to be enabled WPA version 3 on 6 gigahertz. And then there is an option for the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz radios to use something that's called transition mode, which basically means if a device supports WPA version 3, it will use it. But if it doesn't, then it will go back to WPA version 2. But the thing we have to watch out for here is that this could cause you some compatibility issues for your client devices. I was able to associate my current iPhone to that network, which was on 5 gigahertz, and it connected no problem at all. But when we asked the question earlier, what is some of the biggest problems with our Wi-Fi networks? A lot of you said the same thing, and it's our users with their client devices. Isn't it,
Yeah,
Mac?
who's that user? Of course, mate. So that is Matt in like 5 years of continuous working for 20 hours a day. He will go a little bit gray, probably grow his beard a little bit. And this is his favorite device, iPhone 3GS. And he's still smiling. But the second you enable WPA3 on your tri-band SSID, his iPhone 3GS will no longer be able to connect. And then he will start crying. So please don't enable WPA3 across all 3 bands. Don't use single multi-band SSIDs. Use single band SSIDs pretty much always. There are corner cases like edge roam and stuff like that. We had a nice discussion on a European webinar actually about that stuff. But generally, do not use multi-band SSIDs. Stick to a single band. Go to the next slide. And what you see here on the next slide here is my Pixel phone sitting on my desk. And I happened to have dual band SSID, Ekahau 5 and 6 gigahertz, and I wasn't moving my phone around me. It was sitting stationary on my desk, and I was still jumping between 2 different frequency bands. I was jumping from 5 to 6, from 6 to 5, not too often, maybe every few hours. I was reviewing logs. It wasn't a hardcore jumping between frequencies all the time, but it was happening, and it wasn't predictable, and my device was on my desk. Now, imagine if my device was not on my desk, I would be jumping between these 2 frequencies even more. And when you jump cross bands on Wi-Fi 6E, at least, you will lose connectivity, okay? If you are on the call and you jump from 5 to 6 or from 6 to 5, you will have degraded quality of your voice or video, or you can even drop off from the network, panic scan, discover your new channel, and connect back to the network. So always stick to single SSID, and that is a conclusion to SSID's design.
Yeah, great recommendation there, Mac. And in a question that we are seeing a lot at the moment, especially with obviously technology is always evolving, and we are going to be looking at Wi-Fi 7 in the near-ish future. Question is that, will my Psychic 2 support Wi-Fi 7? And well, what is Wi-Fi 7? So Wi-Fi 7 will be the next generation of Wi-Fi that comes out, and it'll be working across the 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz band. And the very quick, easy answer is yes. The Psychic 2 will definitely be able to support Wi-Fi 7. Wi-Fi 7, like we said, will be working across the 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz frequency bands, which is the frequency bands that the Psychic 2 supports. And the way that Wi-Fi in the standard has to work, it has to be backwards compatible with previous generations of Wi-Fi. So when you go and do your validation walkarounds with the Psychic 2, if there's Wi-Fi 7 access points out there, we're going to be able to discover them for you, show them on the floor plan, heat maps, etc., etc. So just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. And we always wanted to have some key takeaways from our webinars. So we won't run through this line by line. Please feel free to just grab a quick screenshot, or when we distribute the content after the webinar later on today, you'll be able to watch it back and you'll be able to see it. So the main kind of like key takeaways from the webinar today. And we are at pretty much the top of the hour, and a huge thank you to everybody at Ekahau Dale, Stu, Mac, and the rest of the Ekahau marketing team for getting this webinar running. But obviously, a big, massive thank you to all of you amazing attendees today for joining us. Thank you so much for being here. We can't wait to see you again on the next one. We hope you enjoyed the content today and have a fabulous rest of your week. And we will see you very soon.
And great outfits too.
Well,
thanks, guys.
you. This is the way. Right? So yes. All right. See you guys later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.